Hello, and welcome to the L&D Go Beyond podcast, where we gather workplace learning insights from experts to enable the L&D community go beyond. My name is Amit Garg, and this is episode number 23. And today we have Charles Jennings joining us. Charles, as some of you would know, is a leading thinker, practitioner, and consultant in the field of building high performance in organizations. He has more than 40 years experience working with innovative approaches to improve talent, learning, and business performance. He is particularly known for his work with the 70-20-10 performance improvement model. Charles's long career includes roles as a business school professor, a company executive, and an international consultant. The topic that we'll be discussing with Charles today is bridging the gap between learning and performance. Charles, so happy to have you with us today. Very welcome.
I'm delighted to be here, Amit, and thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure. Thank you. Charles, this is a very, very important topic. Let's dive straight in. We all know that there's often a big gap between learning and performance in organizations. So in your experience, you work with so many organizations. What are some of the key reasons why there is such a big gap between learning and performance in organizations?
That's a really very, very good and challenging question, Amit. And if I took a step backwards, I can give you the sort of high level and almost glib response that I worked with a man called Jay Cross for a number of years, and you may know Jay, and many people know Jay. He was a great advocate of informal learning and wrote a wonderful book on informal learning. And Jay died 7 years ago, actually 7 years ago tomorrow. I'm sorry, no, that's not right. It's his birthday is tomorrow. He died 7 years ago. But Jay often said, in answer to this question, the problem is many people can't differentiate between schooling and learning because we've all been through school and college and university and so on, and therefore we automatically associate learning with structured formal processes, and that's quite natural. But actually, that's a barrier in a way to bringing together, to bridging this gap between learning and performance, because formal structured learning, the sort of learning we've all done through schooling and college and university, the outcomes we're looking for there are to pass the test, to achieve the result, to get the certificate, whatever that happens to be. Whereas it's not really focused on taking what we've learned away and making sure that we deliver on it. And again, at a high level, I would say that one of my few heroes, Jerome Brunner, the great educational psychologist, once asked the question, what's the difference between learning physics and being a physicist? And what Brunner was getting at, and what his response to that was, when we learn physics, we get the certificate, but are we really a physicist or anything? Are we a lawyer? Are we a whatever we happen to be? Are we a service center representative? And what Brunner was saying was, no, we have the certificate, we have the base, basically the license to operate. And what makes us an expert, what makes us a professional, I guess, in whatever area we're working in, is Brunner explained it in terms of being inculcated into the culture of the profession. And I'd expand on that a little bit. So it's really around, we learn through experience. Our prime way in which we learn is through experience. And so if we're thinking just about learning in terms of formal structured learning, consuming content, working with others, passing the tests, getting the tick in the box, unless we tie that in with experience, we're never going to be able to demonstrate performance. And that's a major problem, because a lot of learning and development professionals and L&D organizations are almost backed into a corner because our key customers think that learning is schooling. So our key customers, the managers and people who request our services often say, I want a course on X. Our sales training program isn't up to scratch. We need a new sales training program. And that's that's in what I'd call the learning paradigm, the learning mindset. And I contributed to a book 7 years ago now called 70-20-10 Towards 100% Performance, that my colleagues Jos Harritz and Vivian Heinen and the three of us wrote. Ross wrote most of it, but Vivian and I contributed to it. And in that, we identified the difference between what we call the learning paradigm and the business paradigm. And the business paradigm is where performance sits, and business in the wider sense, an organizational paradigm, I guess. And it really is a big jump to move from one to the other. And I think that's, in answer to your question, what's the main reason between this gap? And the reason, I think, is because we're thinking about learning in the learning paradigm. We're thinking about the outputs of learning. What can we do to provide people with appropriate learning to achieve the outputs of that learning? So we're measuring learning goals. We have learning goals. We have learning analysis. We're looking at mainly knowledge deficits. We're not looking at performance or business problems. We're not looking at business analysis and performance and business goals. And so there's quite a gap there. And in my experience, Amit, where I've seen really great chief learning officers and learning leaders really get over this gap, quite often they don't come necessarily from a learning and development background. They come from some different background where they really, either they're embedded in the business or they come from left field somewhere, but they understand that what our job is. And I've always said that learning and development professionals, as a learning and development professional, my main job is to help people do their jobs better and to help organizations perform better. But actually the other way around. So we help our organizations to perform better, because if our organizations don't perform, we don't have a job. But within that, we need to help. In order for that to happen, we need to help individuals do their jobs better. And so that sometimes may involve formal learning, but often it involves other things as well. It involves making sure people have the right tools, they have the clarity of goals and clarity of process, and they have the right processes and all those sorts of things. They all fit together. And one of the key things about this 70-20-10 framework, and I think people misunderstand it a lot, it's around expanding our view on learning to say, okay, how is it that learning can contribute to that goal of helping our organizations perform better and help individuals and teams perform better? And the answer is, well, we have to look at it holistically, almost in a systemic way. So the knowledge and skills, that's one part of it, but it's not the only part of it, and is very often not even the main part of it. And so we have to sort of think about, if we're going to close this gap between learning and performance, we've got to take a step backwards and think about not just knowledge and skills, but we have to think about all the environmental factors. Do people have the right tools, the right clear processes? Are there aligned purpose? I mean, going to Daniel Pink's book, Drive, he talks about the key motivators are autonomy, mastery, purpose. And that purpose driver is really critical, because if my values, my drivers aren't aligned with my organization's values and drivers, it doesn't matter how much knowledge I have, I'm not going to be delivering high performance on an individual level. It's a very long answer to your short question, but I hope that addresses it.
Yeah, but I kind of expected, because there are so many dimensions to that, and I'm sure you haven't yet covered everything, but there is a lot to unpack in that. Of course, I see it as two main parts. One is the starting point is wrong, which is seeing it as formal education, as assessment, just like it was in school. And second is seeing it in isolation, not embedded in the business, not looking at what else needs to be done to get performance. So maybe it is not so good starting point, and also having a limited view of what learning has to deliver.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Those two key elements are really critical, because I think one of the challenges that we need to address and break through is thinking that the problems can all be solved by by giving people the right information and building that right knowledge. Now, obviously, we need to have knowledgeable people and skillful people who work in the organization, but unless we consider that in the larger whole, it's really will not work. So this is where L&D sits in, and again, in the book we wrote, we talked about the training bubble, about L&D living in a bubble, or potentially living in a bubble, where we're focused simply on training without doing anything else. And actually, we see it again and again and again outside of learning and development. You see, I mean, we see it around the world, I think, at the moment. If we look at a sort of global level, I saw in the US a couple of months ago, there was an issue with some incorrect behavior in the Congress. And the first response was, we need to train everybody on diversity. We need to have everybody in diversity training. We've seen it the same here, where I'm in the UK. We see exactly the same, where there's some compliance issue. And the answer is, we need to train everyone in compliance. And we all know that compliance training can be useful. It can help us focus and make sure that we remind people what's expected of them, you know, what's acceptable in terms of behaviors, and also the processes they need to follow. But actually, training people on compliance and diversity training and almost anything, if it's just done in isolation, actually has little, if any, effect. In fact, Jeff Kaplan, who's one of the world experts on compliance training, has shown in meta-studies that actually compliance training alone really has little effect in terms of compliant behavior. So getting that transfer between, or that move between people knowing about things and people behaving in a different way, in more compliant ways, that's really the critical thing. And in fact, a meta-study that was carried out and published in Harvard Business Review on diversity training showed that diversity training, and this was a meta-study over, I think it was over 37 years, and there was a massive studies, showed that diversity training had little or no effect, and in some cases actually had negative effect, particularly with African American women in the US in the workplace. So the training, as long as the training is linked with lots of other things, that's great. But thinking about training as being a problem solver in itself, it really is a challenge if we have that mindset.
Yeah, yeah. And compliance training is an area in itself that we can have conversation about how it is done badly in most organizations, and what is it really achieving, and possibly the ill effects of not so great compliance training in terms of
That's right. And actually Jeff Kaplan identified one of the key issues with a lot of compliance training, in that it wasn't specific enough to individuals. So compliance training is often given to people with lots of different roles. Actually, it's too general, so it's not specific. And so you find that people in Kaplan in his writings, and he's written about the fact that he interviewed some people, and one was a senior banker in London, and Kaplan's based in the US, but interviewed a senior banker, and he simply had his teenage child click through his compliance e-learning, and Kaplan said, actually, why not? Because it was meaningless to him. He didn't really relate to his job, relate to his role. So why not just do it efficiently? And of course, compliance training used to be one of the key factors of it. Was it? And I paraphrase this because I think it was around keeping the chief executive out of prison. And nowadays, over the last 30 or 40 years, most courts, when those situations of non-compliance have occurred, actually it's found that despite the fact that everyone's been trained, it won't keep the chief executive out of problems, because the legal system say actually you are responsible for the behaviors and for the processes in your organization, and if they're gone awry, we don't really care how much compliance training you've done because you haven't put other things in place. Yeah. So as you say, we could have a whole hour or a few hours talking about compliance training.
But that that point that you made about it is made available to everyone and doesn't remain relevant to any specific role. That's true for a lot of trainings. We end up doing trainings which are just so broad in their approach that they are not really impacting any one particular role. So people start feeling it's not relevant for me. So yeah, that signs of that is possibly seen in other types of training also.
Absolutely, I totally agree. In fact, I take it a little bit further. Not only is it not relevant for a particular role, but unless we think at a greater or more granular level about what we're trying to help people to do their jobs, even if we stick at role level, generally for training, it becomes quite general. That's why the methodology that we developed, the 70-20-10, or what we call the performance-based learning methodology, we always start with critical tasks. So you don't start with the roles and competencies of those roles. You start at the other end. You say, what is the organization trying to do? What are the organizational objectives? And in those organizational objectives, this group of people, how do they contribute? And in their contribution, what are the tasks we expect them to carry out? Mm-hmm. And when we go down to next level, we say, what are the critical tasks that are required to be carried out in order to achieve these goals? So if you start at the critical task level and identify that, and often these tasks aren't the tasks that are defined in a job role definition. They're often not the tasks that are defined when you speak to the manager of a group of people to say, what is it that they need to do? It's actually what the people actually do. And when you get down to that level, then you can provide support or training or whatever it happens to be to help them deliver those tasks. And I think that is really critical. And strangely enough, the economists, the macroeconomists, have understood this for years and years and years. So learning and development is sort of catching up with people like Kenneth Arrow is one of the greatest macroeconomists, American macroeconomists. He was awarded his Nobel Prize in 1972. And he wrote a lot about learning by doing, Arrow. And Arrow's position was learning is the product of experience. Therefore, it can only take place during activity. So in other words, when you get down to, and quite a few other economists like Andreas de Grip at the European Research Centre for Education and the Labour Market, and various others, Stieglitz is another one, have written a lot about the fact that the way in which learning occurs, we learn to do things by doing them, we reflect on what we've done, we get better. And again, if we think of any, I often use sporting analogies, and particularly because there's a very interesting test match going on this morning between India and England, and being an Australian, I always say I support two teams. I support Australia and ABE, in other words, anyone but England. So of course I'm supporting the Indian team at the moment. But when you take analogies such in the sporting world, we wouldn't imagine that teams are going to be able to deliver on what's expected of them without lots of practice, without learning through experience, without collaboration, across the team, but also with all the people who are surrounding that team, and also a lot of reflection. So, I've said for many years that when we look at what learning is all about, it's about four things. It's about rich and challenging experiences. It's the more experiences we have, the more we learn and the better we become. And again, you could look at it in a medical world and say, well, of course, look at a top surgeon, the top surgeon's part of the reason is maybe some sort of innate ability, but most of it is around a lot of experience, a lot of practice, wide experience. Then the practice piece is critical. I mean, we don't imagine any top sports people, and again, the Wimbledon tennis championship is going on here in the UK at the moment. We don't imagine for a minute that Rafa Nadal or Djokovic or any of the top players, Serena Williams, who went out very early on this year, but we don't imagine that they don't practice between Wimbledon and the US Open. Of course they are. They're back on the practice court absolutely the next day. So that practice piece is the second piece. Then the third piece is really around learning through conversations and networks. And going back to Jay Cross, another thing Jay always said, which was really, I think, absolutely correct, was that conversations he called them the stem cells of learning. We're social beings. We learn through conversations. And people like Professor Rob Cross in the US, who's the expert on social network analysis, has done a lot of research with his teams to show that people who have richer networks in organizations and outside organizations are better performers. So we know that those conversations and networks are critical. And the last one, of course, is reflection. And reflective practice is absolutely critical for, again, can you imagine the Indian cricket team winning today or tomorrow or losing tomorrow, that they're not going to sit down and reflect on what happened, why it happened, what they do next time? Of course they would. And again, I think in the knowledge industries, we've forgotten quite a lot of that. And but when we get down to it and we think about what we as learning and development professionals do, we should be encouraging people to have opportunities to rich and challenging experiences, all those things, opportunities to practice, conversations, networks, and reflection. They're all really critical.
So again, quite a lot to unpack in that. But just like you talked about, any of the sports, and obviously the starting point is, you took an example of critical tasks, right?
Yeah.
So essentially what you're looking at is what an individual is supposed to do. Let's work backwards from there and see where the gaps are. And then again, maybe what you originally said or initially said about what are the other things we need to do. It could be just knowledge that we are giving, but they don't have equipment, they don't have the environment, they don't have support, etc. But coming back to those sports people, one of the analogies I have been sometimes using is about learning to ride a bicycle. Unless you do it, you haven't learned it.
Yeah.
So unless you've done it at least once successfully, you haven't really learned it. You know a little bit about it, but you don't know how to do it. And with experience, maybe you become a little bit better on it and you keep practicing it and you become very, very good at it. And then you can do a little bit of, extra things that normally normal bicyclists may not want to do. So I think that's crucial.
Absolutely. And Amit, I have never met anyone whose parent or guardian sat them down and taught them Newton's third law of motion, the law of entropy, before they got on a bicycle to practice. How most of us learned to ride a bicycle was a parent probably put us on a little bicycle and gave us a push and said pedal. And you pedaled and then you fell off and you got up and you pedaled again and maybe you went a bit further. So we learned it's a good example in terms of we sort of know that if you don't keep pedaling or don't keep going forward, you fall off. But that doesn't necessarily require a deep knowledge of Newtonian physics. So we learn by in the case of a bicycle, we learn by doing. And in the case of a lot of things, we learn by doing until we experience it. We might know a lot about it, but until we experience it, we're not really going to say we've learned it. In fact, Eric Kandel, who won his Nobel Prize for Learning and Memory many years ago, referred to learning as behavior change. Now, actually, I think it's probably a behavior change plus a few other things, but it's essentially behavior change. And unless you can observe the behavior change, you can't really determine that learning has occurred. And I've had lots of discussions around with philosophers and various others around what is learning. And for me, the answer is it's observable behavior change. So if someone can do something better than they did before, they've learned it. If someone can do something in a different way to the way they did before, learning has occurred. Simply by passing the test is not necessarily a representation of learning. In fact, I would say that quite a lot of the tests that we do, particularly with e-learning, is actually short-term memory retention. We're given a pre-test. Okay, what do you know? I know this. You go through the content. What do you know now? I know this plus. That's short-term memory retention. And I often tell a story, Amit, of when I was an undergraduate at university, and I graduated initially in natural sciences, and I was at the University of Sydney, and it was in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and we went into the big hall for our final year examination, and we'd been working on our exam for about 10 minutes, and all the lights went out. There was a power cut, and we all were told to put our pens down and sit and wait, and we waited for 5 or 10 minutes, and finally, one of the invigilators people who were managing the process stood up and said, "Look, this is a general power cut. We're going to collect your scripts. The exam," and I think it was an organic chemistry exam, if I remember rightly, your exam is which we'd all crammed to know all the structures and all the processes and all the things. And the invigilator said, "We're going to collect your scripts and we're going to reset the exam for the end of the exam period," which was about 3 weeks further on. And I clearly remember coming out into the main quadrangle of the University of Sydney and standing around with my friends and all of us saying, "This is absolutely terrible. We're going to have to learn all this stuff again," because we knew that we wouldn't remember it for 3 weeks. We'd remember it for a few days. And so that model, and this is one of the things I find with often when people use Kirkpatrick, the Kirkpatrick model, they talk about learning. And actually a lot of it is often short-term memory retention. Learning is when you change behaviors. So the only way you can determine learning is by observing people doing things differently.
And the way, we have been seeing it as adding practice, like you said, a lot of practice is very important. And, I want to take you to what Julie Dirksen says in her book, because you talk about sports and how it is getting manifested in sports more easily. She also talks of saying, whenever there is a case of or a situation is involving life and death, you would normally find simulated training.
Yeah.
Whether it is for nurses or medical professionals or for aircraft pilots or whoever. But for others, we somehow seem to believe learning can happen magically. You don't need that sort of simulated environments. So obviously there is the disconnect. So what you're saying, of course, matches with how it should happen, but we don't seem to be really bringing it to all the other situations where, again, learning will happen exactly in the same manner, even if it is less riskier, outcome.
Yes, I absolutely agree with Julie, and that simulations are great where there's risk of, if you make errors, there is high levels of risk. But, really good simulations, and the aviation industry has been doing it for years, and as you say, medicine and so on, is really, really excellent, but it's often expensive. But what that simulation is doing is it's providing people to have a rich and challenging experience. It's providing them the opportunity to make mistakes without causing death. But there are other things we can do. And there's a very good book I would recommend to people called Black Box Thinking. I don't know whether you've read it, written by a man called Matthew Syed. And actually, I mean, it's a nice link into sport, because Matthew was the British champion table tennis, or the British table tennis champion for 10 years. And Matthew has a belief that he doesn't believe in talent. He believes that people get to the level that he was as a table tennis player by practice. But Black Box Thinking compares two industries. One industry which is extremely safe, and one industry which is not so safe. And the reason I'm telling you this is that there are other things around the simulations which really are important, because the two industries you talked about both have simulations, and one industry is aviation. The aviation industry is incredibly safe. When we get on an aeroplane, we're probably in the safest environment that we're going to be in that day, actually. The industry he compared it with was the medical industry. Now, the difference between the two, they both have highly structured, really great training programs and training structures in order to, if you're going to go work on a flight deck, if you're going to be a pilot, for example, or if you're going to be, a medical consultant or a surgeon or whatever, you'll go through very, very rigorous and long structured training. But the difference between the two, and medicine, by the way, it's certainly far better than it was, in the Middle Ages, but still medicine, there's quite a lot of errors. And part of the reason that Syed talks about is that it's about a culture of, I suppose we'd now term it psychological safety, in that in the aviation industry, for example, there is legislation, there are rules that say if an error occurs on a flight deck, or if there's a potential issue on a flight deck, you report it. You are protected by law from being punished by it. Then those are shared, they're gathered together. I had a friend who was a pilot for British Airways for many years, and he said it was great. Every 2 months he'd get a report from around the world, from airlines, of people, critical incidents, and how those incidents were addressed. So within the aviation industry, what they've done is built this culture of continuous improvement, this openness to learning from mistakes, learning from near mistakes. And actually, in the medical industry, and I can't really, it's difficult to speak worldwide, but certainly in my experience, the medical industry often doesn't have that. It has a rich hierarchy, a sort of quite a strict hierarchy. And often, I have seen some great examples. I've seen examples where general practitioners, where doctors get together once a month and talk about their, what went well, what didn't go well, and reflected on those things. But often there's not a lot of reflection in the medical industry in terms of what we could do better. So although they both use simulations heavily, they're both highly trained, there's a difference in terms of culture. And that culture for aviation is all around the freedom to speak up, the freedom to, the obligation to talk about when we make errors, and to accept that all of us are humans and we all make mistakes. And so there are other things at play in there as well. So absolutely.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I mean, and we'll come to the culture bit, again, but absolutely, I think providing that psychological safety and ensuring that you are able to speak up and discuss and reflect on what's going well, what's not going well, is going to lead to everybody improving over a period of time continuously.
Yes, and Amy Edmondson talks about this so well. She says we're all pretty good at impression management. So when we see something going wrong, we don't speak up. If we don't know about something, if we don't know how to do something, we don't ask questions. And that's us all managing others' impressions of us. And actually, a culture of psychological safety is when people feel absolutely free to say, look, I don't know how to do this, or I've done this and I don't think it's right, or I don't think the process we've got in place here is the right one. So challenging the status quo, those sorts of things. And they are absolutely critical. And they all fit into, I guess, into this bucket around culture, organizational culture, which is sort of underpins, I think, a lot of the things we work around. Because we often talk about learning in terms of practical terms. There's learning is really important in terms of helping people think in particular ways, helping people the way in which they interact with others and so on. And that's all about the culture of the organization. I think that culture is really critical in this, but culture isn't something that we can just create. In fact, I dislike the term learning culture. I always prefer to use the term creating a culture of continuous improvement, because culture sort of emerges. We can't manipulate culture. Cultures, we can observe it, which is really important, because when we observe it, we can actually identify where we need to change things and what we need to do. But I don't know whether you know Niels Fleging, who's written a lot about this. He's a German, works in our area, but is a philosopher really. And he just says no one can change culture. No one has to. Culture just looks after itself. It's, because as long as we do things differently, the culture will change. And we see it quite often with big organizations. You have a culture. Again, I worked for Reuters and I worked in the financial services for quite a few years. And you'd see it in big banks and big financial institutions. There'd be a particular culture would emerge, and then there'd be some critical incidents, and the head would be chopped off the bank. In other words, the CEO and some of the teams would go, and they'd be replaced. And the culture would change, not immediately, but change over time, because what the observable behavior that the senior people carried out trickled into the organization. And when I was at Reuters, there was a CEO who was there at the time, a man called Tom Gloser, and he really supported a culture of learning, and he did it through the fact that whenever there was not once in the 8 years I was at Reuters when I wanted Tom to come and speak to maybe a group of managers or a group of people, did he refuse to do so if he happened to be in the same country as me, the same city. And Tom always said to me, Charles, he said, I was a lawyer. He said, I can do a lot with a little. Give me 2 or 3 key points you want to get across, and I can just talk to those. And that was a culture of just being open and being accessible, being available, and just supporting things. And I think that's really critical in the way that we can really help move to this culture of performance, this performance-based culture. And as I say, rather than a learning-based culture, a performance-based culture, a culture of continuous improvement.
Yeah. And the thing about performance improvement culture is that it's not really only L&D which should be really thinking about it. You have to work with the managers and everyone else in the organization literally to implement that, to nurture that.
Absolutely. I think, again, one of the things that I sort of wince when I hear people talk about L&D and the business, like the business is separate from us. Well, actually, no. If you're a learning professional, you are part of the business. If you're working in a learning organization, a learning company providing services, you're working with your clients, you co-create, you work with your clients. And again, the methodology that we developed, the 70-20-10 performance-based learning methodology, one of the key elements of that is co-creation, on the basis that we don't have all the answers. L&D doesn't have all the answers. We don't have a relationship where we take an order and then we deliver on that order. We need to co-create. And as we've been talking about, usually the solution isn't simply a knowledge and skills solution. The solution involves lots of other elements. And so it brings in people in different roles in the organizations. And in fact, one little example I can give you is when I did some work with Citibank and the 70-20-10 Institute, we worked quite a bit with Citibank. I think I had as many conversations and meetings with people in corporate communications and internal marketing as I did with L&D when we started out, because there was a campaign. Citi was moving from a model of courses to campaigns. Of course, they still run courses, absolutely, but they felt that in order to make changes, they needed to take on a campaign mindset. And L&D, that's not comfortable. Just L&D is not sort of comfortable with that. Whereas people who work in marketing or corporate communications, they live and breathe campaigns, and it was brilliant. I mean, they really came together very well and produced some really powerful campaigns with great marketing and really strong branding and all those things. And so that's just a little example of the fact that L&D can't do it all itself. And again, I'll just touch on measurement, because I think one of the challenges we have with measurement in moving from this learning mindset to this performance mindset is to acknowledge that the metrics that we use as L&D and traditionally have used as L&D are not necessarily the metrics that are best used to demonstrate performance outputs. So I don't think I've ever met a senior executive who's really interested in how many people have passed or been through a particular program, unless, of course, it's compliance when the regulatory authorities require 85% completion or something. But otherwise, what people are really interested in is how is this impacting or helping us move on our journey? How is it helping us align with our strategy, move our strategy forward? How is this helping us transform the way we want to transform? And if we're going to measure that, learning metrics don't really do that for us. We need to think about what are the metrics that our stakeholders use. What metrics are they working with? And I can give you another example. We worked at the Institute, we worked with Hilti, the big global company that's in the construction industry. And they wanted help to improve. They had a major issue with their sales leaders, the sales managers. They had a high level of turnover. The company was growing rapidly at the time. And they had one metric they used, which is what they call time to performance or time to productivity. In other words, they measured how long it took a sales leader between when they were recruited to when they started earning money for Hilti, rather than paying back the cost of their recruitment, their onboarding, their development, and so on. And they found that was taking sometimes, well, usually about a year before they got payback, sometimes more than that. And of course, being sales managers, they were part of their packages were bonuses. And so therefore they weren't receiving bonuses because the time to payback was too long. And therefore it was a sort of a cycle that therefore there was higher turnover. And so we worked with the L&D team and some of the regional sales people at Hilti, and redesigned their onboarding program, trimmed it right down and focused just on how are we going to help reduce this time to performance, this time to productivity. And certainly in Southeast Asia, where there was a major issue, it was taken down from over a year to under 3 months for 75% of the sales managers. So the metrics that was used wasn't a learning metric. It was simply, and of course that transfers into millions, of whatevers in terms of cash. So those sort of, when we're thinking about measuring, how can we measure this? The answer is L&D should always be working with stakeholders in order to define the metrics that are going to be used. And quite often the data is already being collected. So we need to just hook into that. And if we're using learning metrics, sometimes they're useful to tell us a little bit about how we might be able to improve our processes. So if there's some formal learning in there, the metrics that we collect may be able to help us to redefine restructure our formal learning and so on. But it's having that performance mindset, thinking about what are we doing to help our organizations do things better, helping people and teams in our organizations to do things better, and work back from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I have had a few conversations, and of course, sales related trainings, you can have more immediate feedback in terms of business metrics. For some of the other trainings, it may be a little more involved in trying to work on it even before you start the project. It's almost like doing a consulting assignment to see what are you going to measure. So beginning with that sort of a mindset where you have a productivity measure or a outcome that you are able to track, that, and then working backwards from there would be a good start, maybe.
Absolutely. I mean, you shouldn't start. No L&D project should start unless you know the current state and what the desired state is and how you're going to measure that. And if you don't know that, if you don't know what your current state is, in other words, you haven't done a proper performance analysis to really understand what the current performance is, and you don't have a clear view with your stakeholders in terms of what the desired state is, and you haven't decided the metrics, and so you shouldn't start. And you should just, L&D should just push back and say to people who are asking them to do this, if someone says, we want a new sales manager program, you say, hold on, yes, happy to do that. But before we do that, tell me what's the problem, what's the current issues, what are the problems, and what do you expect people to be able to do? What are you expecting them to be able to deliver and have that clarity? And we have this model, which we often show as a circle of these five roles for L&D. And there's the performance detective, the role that carries out 9 critical tasks, in fact, to determine what the performance issue is, the business issues, organizational issues, performance issues. Then we have an architect that designs the solution, a master builder that builds it, and these are just roles. And then there's a game changer, which is like the Citibank. That's about how do we make sure it's embedded in the culture of the organization. And the fifth one is the tracker. And I often think that you need to put the tracker at the front, because often the tracker and the performance detective work together, often the same person doing the same role, the same person doing those two roles, where we say, what's the current state? What's the future state? How are we going to measure the difference or the reduction in the difference? And so that's, and I guess it's just taking a sort of process engineering approach to learning and development. And I use those words very wisely, very carefully, because, you know, business process engineering has a sort of particular overtones to it. But I think about thinking about these things in terms of performance and business performance, and stepping up just from individuals to teams and to organization. And again, it means that organizational development, OD and L&D, are becoming much more intertwined. It means that L&D becomes much closer, needs to work much more closely with other parts of the organization in order to achieve outputs.
Yeah. Charles, if I were to look at, you know, those four ways we learn that you talked of, you know, experiences, practice, having conversations, and time to reflect, and map it with 70-20-10, are they pretty much the same, or is there a difference? And how can, you know, an organization really leverage 70-20-10 to bridge this gap between learning and performance?
Yeah, Amit, I think, you know, they all intertwine. And this, I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of people misunderstand 70-20-10. They think of 70-20-10 as being buckets. You know, we have a bucket of formal learning, we have a bucket of social learning, and we have a bucket of experiential learning. A lot of people express it that way. Whereas 70-20-10, and certainly the way that I've used it and developed strategies around it and worked on it, is actually helps us look at the whole intermingling of all of those things. And but the principle is, if we think about how people learn, we can come back to those 4 points, you know, through rich and challenging experiences, through opportunities to practice, through deep and meaningful conversations and networks, and through reflection, those 4 things. If we think about those in the concept and put our hats on 70-20-10 hats, we can say, well, okay, so the 20 is we learn through others, we learn with and through others. So clearly, you know, we can map some of these things. So obviously conversation and networks are really important there, but reflection is really important in terms of learning through others. As I say, I know of a medical team that sat down once a month with their lessons learned, and they'd talk about what went well. They'd talk about the patients where they had great outcomes and not so great outcomes. So that's a social learning. And then the learning through working, the 70, is really around, you know, how do we learn from work, and we learn within work. They're the 2 pieces. Actually, we also learn by adding learning into work, but that's what we probably call 10 plus. So formal, a lot of people, I've seen a lot of people say, we've got this great 70-20-10 program, and I look at it, and what it is, it's a really great formal learning program, because it's integrated some social learning aspects, it's integrated some work aspects, but it's a formal construct, and that's great. I mean, that's fantastic. But that's not how certainly I'd view 70-20-10. And I think that the 70-20-10 is a way to integrate and combine all of these approaches and tools that we have to get better outcomes. And actually, again, in the book we wrote, we talked about them being this little diagram showing the 70-20-10 as little circles, all overlapping. Because when we look at a good formal solution, it often will include some social learning, some experiential, some learning in the workplace. When we look at a really good solution that's based around maybe coaching or peer coaching or something like that, it inevitably will have a bit of the 70 and the 10 in it. And when we look at solutions in the 70 space, where we're maybe providing rich performance support tools and processes and so on in the workplace, that quite often will have other bits of the 20 and the 10 into it. So we talked about them being recursive, in that they're sort of joined together. So I think if you can think of 70-20-10 as a way to expand our thinking and processes in terms of what we do to deliver better performance, that's the best way to think about it. And in fact, Amit, I've had conversations with people and seen lots of people saying, "Oh, it's not 70, 20, 10. It's actually 55, 5, 5, or it's 33, 33, 33, or whatever it happens to be." And these people say this, and that's fine. Except I just don't think they understand what the framework's about, because the framework is not about the numbers. The framework is about the fact that most learning, and we know that most learning occurs in the workplace. And again, the economists at the European Centre for Education and the Labour Market carried out a study, and they determined that about 96% of learning occurred as part of working. And there's other studies as well, not by learning and development people, but by whether they're economists or whether they're others. I mean, even Deming, the great Edwards Deming, who was responsible really, for one of the key drivers for the recovery of Japan post Second World War. Deming said that about every 10 years during his career, he stepped back and he looked at what percent of the challenges that were presented and the solutions that were found were due to what he called the system. In other words, that's management and the environment, and what he called essentially the performer. And at the end of his career, he determined that around about 6% was due to the performer, and around about 94% was due to the environment. Having clear management, clear direction, the right tools, the right processes, all the systems in place. And so it's, when you look at it in the bigger picture, it's to me, it seems very obvious that we should be thinking about learning and development working across the board, and not thinking just on skills and knowledge, but thinking about how else what other levers we have in order to achieve better outcomes. In fact, I've just published a paper with a chap in Australia called David Broadhurst, who runs a company called CodeSafe, CodeSafe works in safety areas and doing some really interesting things with basically performance support, essentially smart performance support. And we titled the paper, I think it's Beyond the Skills Obsession, on the basis that, of course, we need a skilled workforce, but actually just focusing on building skills is only, it's only a few steps up the ladder, really. We need to go beyond that.
So the skills that somebody is trying to build will map only to the 10% essentially, unless you can really give them the right environment to practice and, have reflections on their own experiences, etc. It would not get internalized and become a, routine way of doing things.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, the skills, how do we develop a skill? Well, we all know we develop, and we don't need to just look in sports world, but we can look anywhere. We all know we develop skills through experience, practice, and so on and so forth, all of those things. And so if we're going to develop skills, simply providing a program for an introduction to or a start to develop people's skills in a particular area, that's great.
Yeah.
That may produce competence.
Mm.
But if you're going to produce expertise, that's never going to be done in formal learning.
Yeah.
And that's the big difference, because when you look at what it is that makes experts, in fact, you often talk to an expert and maybe ask them how they did the job or observe them doing their job, and you see that maybe you'll notice that they're not following a standard procedure. They're not following the standard operating procedures.
Yeah.
And you say, why don't you follow that? The procedure says you should do this, should do A, but you're doing B. And they often say, well, yeah, the procedure's too out of date, or we found a smart workaround,
yeah.
But they haven't actually fed it back to improve the procedure,
right?
Because the processes, the structures and processes aren't in place. So if you're going to produce expertise, most of that learning is highly contextual and happens in the 20 and the 70 space. In other words, learning with and from others and learning through working. So that's where the real expertise is built. And I would throw out the challenge to say, of course, we all want competence. We all want a competent workforce. But what we really need is expertise. So we want competence, we need expertise. And actually, competence is important, but that's not the end point. The end point is L&D supporting the workforce and people. And it doesn't matter what sort of workforce it is. helping them develop the mindsets and the practices which are all around doing their jobs better and continually improving.
Excellent. Excellent. Charles, it's been really wonderful listening to your thoughts and understanding how we really learn and how L&D should be looking at bridging the gap between learning and performance. Really, really insightful discussion. I'd like to thank you for your time today. Really appreciate that.
Thank you, Amit. It's been a real pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.